Hello everyone, this is Scarzig, and welcome back to the Shurima Reveal Reviews. Next up, we've got Lisandra. We're just going to jump right to the chase. She's a 3-mana 2/3 with Tough. When I'm summoned, summon a Frozen Thrall. Now, Frozen Thralls, just to let you know, because this is going to be a big theme for her supporting cards. It's a 1-mana landmark with Countdown 8, summon a Frost Guard Thrall, and we see here a Frost Guard Thrall is an 8-mana 8/8 with Overwhelm. So when you play Lisandra, you get the Frozen Thrall. She levels up when you've summoned 2 or more allies that cost 8 or more. When I level up, create a Watcher in hand. So the Watcher is a 17-mana 11/17. I cost 0 if you've summoned 4 or more allies that cost 8 or more this game. Attack, obliterate the enemy deck. So the Watcher is sort of like, it's a summon expensive units Fiora. You are halfway there once Lisandra levels up. The Frozen Thrall that you summon would potentially count for this too. If you play Lisandra on 3, you aren't going to get the Frozen Thrall for a very long time. The fact that Lisandra has Tough means that she will be able to stick around after the fact, but she doesn't do anything on her own. She doesn't really have any abilities other than summoning a landmark, the Frozen Thrall. When she does level up, though, she puts Tough on your Nexus. So every individual piece of damage that your Nexus takes will be reduced by 1. It's already been confirmed with the developers that they are making it so Teemo mushrooms don't ping you. They're changing it so that right now, the way it works, when you draw mushrooms with Teemo, it just calculates how many mushrooms are on the card you just drew, and then that all slams your Nexus. But it is intentional. It is intended for mushrooms to actually hit your Nexus one at a time. And so once a leveled up Lisandra is in play, your Nexus is Tough, and then you become immune to Teemo mushrooms. This is going to make it very difficult for these Hexcore Foundry decks that have come out of the woodwork here to deal with Lisandra. Decks like Ezreal, it's going to be hard for them to just swing through. Just chip damage and burn based decks, it's going to be hard to punch through if your opponent can complete Lisandra's level up. And summoning 2 8 or more cost units is, in the context of Freljord, very easy, right? You just do your normal thing of playing Trundle on 5, or with Catalyst of Eons, you play them around 4, as the case may be. And then you get your Ice Pillar a few rounds later, so then you can do Ice Pillar into Tryndamere. I'm wondering, like, if people are just going to put Lisandra in as like a one-of and feel the rush, for example, or if there's going to be a bunch of other deck builds besides in order to get the Watcher. Once Lisandra's leveled up, this is all hunky-dory, but a lot of the speculation around Lisandra has mostly been like combos with the Watcher, because you don't necessarily need to meet this requirement of reducing its cost to 0. There's been a bunch of memes around playing Ice Pillar with Monastery of Harana to return it back to your hand and then replay the Ice Pillar. There's been some combo decks kind of theory crafted around using Spectral Matron to bring a copy of the Watcher into play and then attack your opponent. And again, once it attacks, it doesn't need to hit your Nexus. It just needs to attack. Then your deck is obliterated. And if you don't have a champion in play and a champion spell to cast to put another champion to shuffle another champion into your deck, or some other card that shuffles more cards into your deck, you're just going to lose at the start of the next round because you won't be able to draw a card, of course. But jumping through all those hoops, it remains to be seen if that will be worth. There's also, of course, the angle of simply playing a 0-cost Watcher and then also having the threat of atrocity, where if you survive that turn with the Watcher, you'll just die the next round regardless. But leveled up Lisandra still does the same thing when she's summoned. Summon a Frozen Thrall, and at the start of each round, you get a 0-cost Ice Shard in hand. So Ice Shard here is 3 mana fast speed, deal 1 to everything. So that's enemies, friendlies, and both Nexuses. Avalanche actually used to work this way, where we deal 2 to everything, and it gave Freljord some Nexus damage. I think that Ice Shard's going to be great in those Sejuani type decks that want to deal that direct Nexus damage. This gives Freljord a more realistic way to proc their plunder abilities outside of like Ember Maiden or being shoehorned into running Noxus and Bilgewater very heavily for their plunders. So I'm really excited mostly for what Ice Shard does for Scargrounds decks and plunder-based decks, to be honest, rather than just control decks. But having this nice little bit of extra utility will be great, where you get this cheaper kind of baby Withering Whale to clear your opponent's board. Typically control Freljord, you have like no units in play, so the fact that this deals 1 to your Nexus is a perfectly fine payoff for wiping out potentially 4 or more damage from the enemy side, especially when you combine it with Avalanche, so you get 3 damage AoE. A lot of decks would sometimes be able to smork through the control Freljord lists by playing just 3 or 4 HP units that could survive an Avalanche and hit for a couple more rotations of damage. So this rounds it out quite nicely. Leveling up Lisandra very quickly is not going to be, I think, a huge issue, because you're still trying to survive, you're still trying to ramp. Playing Lisandra as a 3 mana 2/3 is, you know, whatever. She has tough, maybe you get some extra blocking out of it. She's going to be very hard to remove when she does come down, like when she levels up like 4 HP plus tough is respectable tankiness, but it's all about the Watcher, baby. Next up, we've got Entomb, 5 mana, fast speed, obliterate a unit, summon a frozen tomb in its place. And the frozen tomb here you can see is a landmark with countdown 2, summon an exact copy of the obliterated unit I replaced. So this is not going to be a card that you necessarily want to run, right? It's pretty expensive. It has a decently powerful effect for like moving something out of the way, peeling 1 blocker so you can maybe swing in. You can use it to stop an enemy from hitting you, a bit like a concussive palm, but I definitely don't see this being main decked. And there will be some emergencies where having a copy of Lisandra's Entomb will bail you out of a bad situation. And sometimes just denying your opponent the use of a unit's ability or a champion level up, for example, could be pretty huge. But you run into the issue of, if you entomb an enemy champion, they can play a new copy of that champion, and then when the entomb hatches, they have 2 copies of that champion in play. You know, we have the same sort of setups with Detain in the game. So this is going to be one of those cards that's going to be terrible until it is not. In the very, very narrow situations where Entomb is useful and you get really strong value out of its effect, it's going to seem amazing, but this is going to be a dead card like 98.5% of the time bet. Frozen Thrall, we touched on a little bit earlier. This is actually main deckable, so you could do Frozen Thrall on 1, or 2 Frozen Thralls on turn 2, Lisandra on 3, then you have your Frozen Thralls cooking, and once those all hatch, your Lisandra will level up. But again, countdown 8 is a pretty long time. If you don't play these on turn 1 or turn 2 or like turn 3 at the latest, you're really gonna be SOL when it comes to getting these stats that you want. It's not a real card, essentially, right? If you draw this in the late game, it's utterly useless. We do have the Draklorn Inquisitor here. It's a 5 mana 4/5. When I'm summoned, summon a Frozen Thrall. At the end of the round, if the countdown of any of your Frozen Thralls is 4 or less, advance them to 0. And this is the card that you want, right? So there's going to be like this weird high roll around Lisandra, Draklord Inquisitor, and Frozen Thrall. I don't think main decking Frozen Thrall is correct. Draklord Inquisitor does summon a Frozen Thrall when he comes into play. It's nice to maybe have a Frozen Thrall that's already been cooking since like round 1 or round 2. So when you get to round 5, you summon a 5 mana 4/5, and then you get an 8/8 with Overwhelm, especially if you're attacking on odds with the Draklord Inquisitor. But I think the downside of not drawing that Frozen Thrall in the early game is going to just be too much of a detriment. I had sort of had a really similar sentiment around Faces of the Old Ones, that 2 mana ramp card. If you behold an 8+ card, then you get an extra mana gem. I felt that it was just too inconsistent for its value, and Frozen Thrall is the same way. I think the very latest you could play Frozen Thrall with the help of Draklorn Inquisitor, right? You could play this on round 2, round 3, and maybe you don't play Draklorn Inquisitor until like round 7, and it's still pretty decent, especially if you have multiple Frozen Thralls from like playing Lisandra on round 3 or round 4. Even when you play Draklorn Inquisitor, it might hatch one of your Frozen Thralls, but then it summons a new one with countdown 8 that you won't be able to get value out of for another 4 rounds. So it's very tricky to say what the mixture is going to be. There will be experiments. You will get high rolled by early Frozen Thrall, but at the end of the day, we still have landmark removal in the game. If Desert Naturalist does end up being a very widely played card in Shurima just as a generic splash, the same way you'll generically run Scorched Earth and a handful of Noxus decks because you have that dual purposed effect, then your opponent could just destroy the Frozen Thrall on round 4 before you get a chance to summon your Draklorn Inquisitor, or depending on what your deck is looking like, you destroy it on round 8, on round 7 before it hatches, that kind of thing. So you spent your whole time counting on this card, on the Frostguard Thrall. You've manipulated your line of play around having this big unit to stabilize you or swing for lethal, and then it just gets denied. But I will say the creeping fear of having a Frozen Thrall in play and having to worry about your opponent playing a Draklorn Inquisitor at any time in the mid game is going to be really hilarious. So next up, we've got Blighted Ravine. It's a 4-mana landmark. When I'm summoned, heal your Nexus for 4. So it's 4 mana, heal 4, countdown 1, deal 2 to everything. So at the start of the next round, essentially, is what countdown 1 will be. So it heals your Nexus for 2, and then has a delayed telegraphed avalanche. A card like this, I think, is going to be pretty tricky to use. Your opponent might not care about Blighted Ravine. You heal your Nexus for 4, you offset a little bit of the incoming damage, and maybe Blighted Ravine plus Ice Shard or some other AoE could be fine, because it's cast immediately at the start of the next round. When the countdown goes off, your opponent isn't going to be able to use any HP buffs or burst speed buffs to save their units or any sort of healing, right? So that is a nice touch. I think that they can't react to this. The 2 AoE damage is guaranteed, but I don't know if this is going to be run over just having an avalanche in your deck. Next up, there's 3 Sisters. I've heard some early talk about this spell being very strong, and I totally get why players would think this is strong, just because of the utility of it. 1 mana, burst speed, create a fleeting flash freeze, Fury of the North, or Entomb in hand. So you get a choice of 3 really decent spells, so there's a lot of flexibility with this card. My big issue is that, again, Entomb is going to be awful 99% of the time. Fury of the North, after it got nerfed, it like immediately stopped seeing play for the most part, and then Flash Freeze is probably the best card of the 3 that are being offered here. Having the flexibility of 1 really good card and 2 like really bad cards, or, well, 1 really good card, 1 medium card, and 1 trash card kind of just means that 3 Sisters just is only giving you 2 choices. And at the end of the day, the sort of decks that would want to run 3 Sisters are the sort of decks that would rather just run Flash Freeze in that deck slot. Because if you're like, man, I have Flash Freeze, so you are just paying 1 extra mana on top of having an extra copy of Flash Freeze for your deck. I love the flavor of this card, don't get me wrong, because Lisandra, Sejuani, and Ashe are, the 3 Sisters that are like fighting for the fate of the Freljord. It is canonically confirmed that Ashe and Sejuani are sisters, but I wasn't sure about Lisandra. I thought she was kind of like an ancient ice witch, and she's like been alive for thousands and thousands of years. So, but whatever. Again, I'm not super versed on the lore. If you're thinking about running 3 Sisters, your deck probably just wants Flash Freeze. Next up, we've got Cold Resistance, 5 mana burst speed, get an empty mana gem, and grant an ally plus 2 HP. There is not a world where you run this over Catalyst of Eons. Maybe in decks that really want to giga ramp, you run 3 Catalyst and 1 Cold Resistance. So you have an extra shot of getting that ramp. But the burst speed heal 3 from Catalyst of Eons is very, very underrated. Even the late game, if you whiff on getting those ramps off in the early mid game and you draw it in the late game, sometimes you're just sitting on Catalyst and you can use it to heal for 3 or 6 to avoid a lethal and buy yourself another turn. And the fact that Cold Resistance is just the Catalyst ramp, but with Troll Chant kind of built into it, or rather Elixir of Iron built into it, is kind of meh. The HP that you grant is permanent. It's simply that, of course, the decks that want to ramp like this usually aren't running a lot of units to make use of the extra HP. So again, I think that this will be just your 4th bad copy of Catalyst of Eons if it does come to that, but that might just end up not being the case. So that's going to be it for the batch of Lisandra reviews. Again, I'm really looking forward to seeing what sort of Watcher memes come out of the woodwork. I think that Spectral Matron Watcher is probably going to prove a little bit too toxic, but it remains to be seen if leveling up Lisandra takes long enough so that decks have enough opportunity to react to that combo. So I'll catch you in the next set of reviews. See you then.